My name is Lorella Praeli. I'm co-president of Community Change. And as we dig into this fireside conversation, we really want to dig into the Latino community in particular. And so one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is that this conversation is about cash, of course, but it is also much bigger than cash. We're living through this moment of deep instability, economic instability, political instability, technological disruption and transition, mass displacement, and growing distrust in institutions. And the market feels increasingly unstable and punishing for many working families, while the government often feels distant, bureaucratic, punitive, or incapable of delivering. Does that resonate with anyone in this room? And Latino working class communities are navigating all of these pressures at once. At the same time, my experience in Latino politics and organizing and the policy world is that there remained profound misunderstandings about how many Latino working families experience, how we experience the economy, how we experience government, and the idea of opportunity itself. Too often, our communities are talked about either through the language of deprivation or through narrow electoral analysis while missing something deeper. That for many Latino working class families, dignity is deeply tied to work, to contribution, to sacrifice, mobility, and the belief that hard work should actually lead somewhere. Does that resonate with you? Which means that the question underneath this conversation is not simply about whether people support government programs or economic assistance, it's whether we can build an economy and public policies that people experience as empowering rather than paternalistic. Policies that expand people's sense of agency and stability and leverage over their lives. Policies that allow people to care for their families, to survive crises, to pursue opportunity, and to imagine a future where they see themselves. So I think ultimately that's what this conversation's about. So it's more than about cash transfers. It's a conversation. I want you to repeat these words with me. It's a conversation about trust. Let's say it, trust. It's a conversation about power. And it's a conversation about mutuality. And we're gonna do that again, okay? Trust. Power. Mutuality. All right, now we're like really getting into it. So with that, I'm gonna toss to you, Manuel, to really ask you to do some more framing for us. You've spent years really studying demographic change, economic inequality, and social movements. What do you think Latino communities are seeing, feeling, and experiencing right now that much of the political class fundamentally misunderstands?
Thank you for that really easy question. So first I want to say what a thrill it is to be here, particularly with Lorella, to be with this group, to be in Austin, although I will confess that when they invited me, they told me it was actually South by Southwest, and that I would be negotiating the film rights to my newest book, in which I would be portrayed by Pedro Pascal. So I mean, this is not disappointing, but it's not that, so.
We will deliver.
Okay. And I always like to let audiences know before I start speaking that if my voice is a little scratchy or worn out, you might think it's because I've been screaming at the television at all the news that's coming.
Or singing to Bad Bunny.
That too. But it's actually, I have a voice condition called spasmodic dysphonia, spasms around the voice box. It's been made famous because it's the condition that Robert Kennedy Jr. has. So you know how his voice is really scratchy? So if my voice was not treated, I would sound like Robert Kennedy Jr. I would not be as fucking delusional as Robert. Kennedy Jr. And mine is treated, this is true, once a month with Botox, because that's how we treat everything in Los Angeles. So, works for almost any health condition. So, the question you asked, I know you forgot about it at this point. I frame by saying, we need to make sure that this conference is not about a tool, guaranteed income, in search of a story. But instead, what's the story for which this is one tool to address our economic issues and economic insecurities? And when I think of that, I think of three kind of interlocking crises that define our age. The first is the crisis of multiracial democracy. Haven't had it for that long, really since 1965, and the Supreme Court is doing everything it can to strip it away. And it's threatened in part because the country is changing. It's slated to become majority people of color by about the year 2045. It's a prospect that fills some of us with delight. I'm from Los Angeles. We became majority people of color in 1988. All I can think is that soon the rest of the country will experience the joy of a Korean taco truck. And what could be wrong with that? But it fills a lot of the rest of the country with dread. And what we're really seeing is a minoritarian project to seize power, for which, by the way, we need a supermajority to counter. The second big crisis is the crisis of economic inequality. In the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, about 10% of national income went to the top 1%. Pretty unequal. Now, more than a quarter of national income goes to the top 1%. And right behind them is a group of professional middle-class workers hoarding onto opportunity, afraid that they will get left behind instead of being able to hang on to the coattails of the 1%. And of course, the third crisis is climate. But what connects all of those crises is disconnection. An older America fearful of a newer and younger America, a class chasm in which people don't see their common fate, and of course, a situation in which people are disconnected from Mother Earth or disconnected from the generations to come. And what I'd suggest is that Latinos are at the cutting edge or the bleeding edge of each one of those, helping to drive that demographic change, but the target of massive disenfranchisement, particularly right now, along with our Black brothers and sisters, indigenous siblings, etc. Of course, in terms of economic inequality, and for all of you who've worked in environmental justice, you know the statistics that race, being Black or Latino, is a much higher predictor of climate risk than income. So I think what we really need to do is to understand the Latino population as being at the center of these crises and at the center of these solutions. Last thing I'll say, which I think is really important, and it leads to your next question, because at least she prepared. I'm just fucking winging it. But one of the things I think that's really important to do about Latinos is to not assume identity. And I think that was really one of the big mistakes progressives have made. They assumed Latinos would be progressive. And they did that in part because a big part of Latinidad came out of the California experience. But that was historically specific. In fact, in California, we called ourselves Chicanos or Mexicanos, or Hispanics. Didn't call ourselves Latinos, really, until the 90s, when there was a full-fledged assault with Prop 187 and the racial propositions that occurred against Latinos. When unions began organizing Latino immigrant workers, and when environmental justice organizations began lifting up the Latino voice. And that really was a progressive Latino identity, but there's lots of other Latino identities that are possible, and they came out in this last election. ¿Por qué MAGA? I mean, you could have predicted it. But I know that's your next question, so go. Pretend to ask me something.
Wow, all right. Well, I'm gonna go to my second question in a second, but before I do that, I do wonder if you think there is a historical unifier or a shared history that we can make sense of when you know, I think it's so important to say, do not assume an identity. And having worked on a presidential campaign, doing Latino vote work, so often people, you know, we live in this category as Latinos of sort of a mobilization category. Are any of you familiar with this term? In political campaigning, there is a persuasion universe. These are voters you spend more resources on, right? You have to persuade them to vote for you. You have to make the case and fight for their vote in a real way. You have to spend a lot more money and a lot more time speaking to these voters. And then there's a mobilization universe. And the mobilization universe is understood as people who are already with you. They just need a little reminder. So you spend much less money trying to talk to these people and trying to convince them and persuade them to vote for you. And my experience is that every 4 years we're sort of discovered again in the sort of postmortems. And also that for a long time people understood us to be a mobilization target. But we're not doing the work of actually making the case. And so deep, sort of built into the political targeting was this assumption that we were loyal to the Democratic Party or that we would vote for Democrats. Actually, and Democrats didn't really have to do any work to deliver the kinds of policies that they promised to Latinos. And so I'm curious here, and then the other question I'll throw out at you, because maybe you haven't prepared for this either, is that there's a sense that many Latinos sort of embody sort of this guest complex. And so this sense of you don't quite really belong in the United States of America. And I wonder if you agree with that. I've seen more sort of research and heard more conversations about that, or if you would tackle that differently.
Those are a really great set of questions. On the first one, I hope people understand this or know this history, but they may not. You know, Hispanics were not a category until about 1970. Now, there were Hispanics before I know. I was one. But they were not a census category, and you have to ask the question, why did that come about? And the reason it came about during the Nixon administration was because the GOP knew that they were throwing away the black vote by pursuing a Southern strategy. And so they were like, we need to cook up another minority group that we can bring onto our side. So Hispanic, Latino has always been a contested political identity. And I think that's the problem. If you think it's a fixed identity, then you're going to mobilize. If you think it's a mutable identity, it's not just that you're going to persuade, it's that you're actually also going to try to understand to be able to persuade. And I think there's not enough effort that's gone in to trying to understand this population and where it's coming from. And I do think you're right that, particularly with the immigrant tradition that's in our communities, by the way, community now that is overwhelmingly US born versus being immigrant, that there's a tendency to think of yourself as a guest. But I think it's really changing. And I hate to be so pop culture, but Bad Bunny Super Bowl because that was an event that said, it's in Spanish, welcome. Here's a world that you are also welcome into. It is a world of family. It is a world of belonging. It is a world that itself is multiracial. It is a world of welcome. And I think that there's a potential transformation that's going on right now where we are no longer guests. We are also part of the hosts, saying we can make this our place and this our future.
I love that. I love that, and it resonates so much. You know, I grew up as someone who was undocumented in the United States for some time, and I never felt like I could claim America for a while, and I also felt like I couldn't quite claim Peru. But once I joined movement, you know, once I walked into a room and I saw a bunch of people wearing undocumented and unafraid t-shirts, everything changed for me. And you know, when I think about the immigrant youth movement and experience, I actually think of people, young people who are practicing citizenship long before, you know, the government sort of confers on them the kind of legal identity or the legal status. And so I've always sort of wondered because it's not been my experience since being a part of a movement that sort of this guest idea. And then the other is, I don't know if Marcela with Somos New Mexico is in the room right now, but I think about the base that she's built in New Mexico and many of the victories that they're powering in the state do not speak. These are mostly immigrant and Latino bases in New Mexico. It does not speak to people who understand themselves to be guests, but they're actually helping to power many progressive victories that are universal in nature. And so I think there's a story there that hopefully I know she's gonna be in a panel later, they'll dig into.
You know, I think you said two things that are quite profound. One is that organizing creates identity. And you should think about organizing not as instrumental, a means to achieve a policy end, but it's fundamental because it's creating a sense of people as being efficacious and recognizing an identity. I was part in the 90s and 80s, 90s, and afterwards about trying to make sure that the Latino identity that was being constructed in California was a people of color identity rather than a white assimilationist identity. Because we could go both directions. The direction we choose is not a function of the pigment of your skin. It is a function of your mentality. Absolutely. And your solidarity with other people. Prompts a story. I was once at a gathering and they had a great icebreaker. And the icebreaker, it was a gathering, it was mostly black folks, and the icebreaker was something your mama told you that you remember, that really stuck with you. And everybody had these great stories about their mothers and church and family events, and all I could think of was my mom, who grew up in Spanish Harlem and was very tough and could curse in both Spanish and English with a ferocity and floweriness that rivaled any truck driver you've ever met. And I kept thinking, what am I gonna say? What am I gonna say? And when it came to me, the thing that came to my mind that my mom did tell me with her finger wagging, you never cross a picket line. You never cross a picket line. And what she meant by that was something quite literal. We were a labor family. You don't cross picket lines. But what she meant was you don't cross someone else's picket line. If people are standing up against police brutality in the black community, you don't cross that line, you stand with them. If someone is standing up against transphobia, you don't cross that line, you stand with them. If someone is terrorizing our immigrant communities, we all stand together. solidarity is a practice, and solidarity is an identity, and it is constructed through organizing. You cannot assume it by virtue of a particular ethnic, racial classification.
Yes, preach now. All right, when are we gonna run him for president? Yes? How many people in this room are either GI recipients or organizing to deliver guaranteed income for many people? Raise your hand up high if you can. Look around the room for a second. Like yeah. Well, everyone, right? Everyone's kind of in this room waiting to, like, fighting to deliver and organizing. Thank you for raising your hand. But how many of you sort of, for whom does it resonate in this room, this idea of organizing, through the work of organizing, you sort of came to understand yourself differently, and maybe you adopted a kind of political identity. You maybe moved from a place of a sense of powerlessness to a sense of pride and power. Raise your hand if you've had that experience, and look around the room for a second. That is the power, the possibility of what we could enable around this country if we know how to engage and reach people in the ways that are culturally appropriate, which leads now to my actual second question. Going back to the beginning of some of the framing, Manuel, and we were talking about Latinos sort of being discovered or rediscovered every 4 years after a presidential cycle. There's been a lot of conversation, especially after Trump's second victory, about Latinos and Latino voters and political realignment or potential political realignment in this country. And again, people misunderstand how class identity operates in Latino communities. And actually, I think for a lot of us, we usually talk about some things like guaranteed income as deservedness. Like, we deserve this. And I would like you to walk us through why that doesn't work for Latinos as much as it maybe does for other communities. And to talk about not just working class as an economic category, but working class as an experience, as working class experienced much more as a moral identity in the Latino community.
Yes, so I think it's important to realize if you look at the data, Latinos are about twice as working class as whites in terms of the share that fit into a working class definition. So when people talk about, when you talk to the working class, they seem to imagine a white industrial worker rather than a gardener or a food service worker or a nurse or anybody else in a bunch of working class professions. And while I'm a fancy pants professor now, I grew up working class in the San Gabriel Valley, east of East LA, and I always think of that experience as really embodying three key values. One was the importance of work, that you were supposed to work and contribute, and that helped to define you. Doesn't mean that people who are disabled or who can't work shouldn't be honored, but they should be given ways to contribute and find meaning. Second, craft, which is that you were supposed to be really good at the work you did. If you were a janitor, which my dad was, you were supposed to be a good janitor. And all of you came into a beautiful place today because there was a good janitor. And that craft is to be respected and rewarded. There is no low-skill work. There's just low-wage work. And the third, which we also talked about, was solidarity. But one thing I think is that too often the appeals around guaranteed income wind up sounding to Latinos like kind of a handout rather than a platform for success. And the stories that you all are telling, they're all stories about how when there's a little bit of support, people can spend more time with their kids. They can take another class at the community college. They can go to the adult ESL class, English as a second language, and get the skills that help them move from the back of the hotel to the front of the hotel. When it is cast not as a safety net, but as a platform for mobility, I think that's a much better approach. Hopefully this will help it stick in your head. I think that a lot of progressives talk about how there's enough wealth to go around. I think for Latinos what works is there's enough work to go around. There's enough opportunities to contribute. There's enough opportunities to earn. There's enough opportunities to own. Because people also want to own houses, they want to own businesses, and if they see this as a route that is based in the values of dignity, of opportunity, and of community, that's a better sell.
Thank you. All right, we've got some real countdown situation going on here. So I'm gonna try
If you were a true Latino, you would ignore that clock. So.
Wow, I feel like I'm being tested right now, but as a co-host organization of this conference, I would like to honor the hard work of people crafting the agenda. But
in solidarity.
In solidarity, we've got 3 minutes. I think I'm going to try to bring two questions together. One is this sort of sense of, we both practice and have a long, sort of a culture of collective care in the Latino community. There are all of these ways in which we already sort of practice guaranteed income. We pool resources. There's a lot of caregiving. There's a lot of informal lending. There's a lot of remittances. And there's a lot of community support. And I was just talking to Aurora from Colorado, whose grandmother, her mother watches her kids. There's just this is just a normal part of our experience. But people are often surprised that we have, and maybe less so now given the current global and national moment we're in, surprised that we have such a high level of distrust of government institutions. And I think some of that is they don't come from sort of wherever you sit in the Latino experience, and you don't necessarily appreciate the sort of authoritarian governments and regimes we have left, or some generation before us left. So I would love for you to speak to that. Hold on a second. Hold on, just countdown. And so how do we think about the tension between us already practicing the sort of collective care and also the high level of distrust with government and institutions? And maybe it's not that hard to understand it when we sort of bring in ICE and CBP, which we haven't really talked about up here, and how disruptive the state is, both in real life and also understood and perceived by Latino communities, Latino families, mixed status families, and sort of their ability to actually access what they need from the government. There are real physical and psychological and emotional barriers in Latino communities across this country of what it means to access even what you are eligible for.
So first, that again is such a good question. My dad came to the United States in the 1930s from Cuba, fleeing a regime where the nickname for the dictator was the Butcher. So you can imagine there's some level of distrust. He was undocumented. He was actually given citizenship during World War II, provided he would fight for the U.S. Army. So one of the things I think is the right has this story that what you should do is just depend on yourself or just your family. The left often has a story about we should depend on the government, right? And I think we really need to depend on each other. And part of that is both mutual aid, which we're celebrating here, but a part of it is also making sure that we make the government ours. And I will end with this story. I was part of a climate catastrophe in Los Angeles at the beginning of last year when there was the big fire. We live in Pasadena. We owned a house right near Altadena, duplex, which we bought because my daughter was studying to be a social worker, and she needed to find a place where she could pay low rent, meaning she didn't pay anything at all. And she evacuated the morning of the fire. She sent me a picture from her Ring camera, and she said, "Wow, the neighborhood's in flames." And it looked like it was coming in the direction of our house. Just at that moment, the front tenant, Luis, showed up because his wife, muy responsable, very responsible, said, "I know there's a fire, but it's trash day, and you should put the cans out." So he showed up, fire down the street. He calls me, shows me there's a fire starting in our backyard. He and his father-in-law, Arturo, who had just lost his home 3 hours earlier, both rushed to the backyard. And with buckets of water and hoses, started to try to put out the flames. Neighbors broke through fences and started to put out the flames, defending us, but also defending their homes. My wife showed up about half an hour later. I showed up about half an hour after that. We were in different locations. And we joined in the fire brigade, putting out these fires all day long, because if you've ever been in a fire, it just pops back up. 3 or 4 houses up, the fire department was staging the stand, trying to prevent the big fire from coming our way. And they were successful. At one point, a firefighter walked by me. I was in the backyard hosing, and I said, "We could use some help here." And he said, "I think you got it. I'm going to the big fire." And I thought, well, he's right. And I take from that story 3 lessons which actually fit this. First, sometimes when there's a fire, you just gotta rush to it. Second, it's better if you go there with your friends and neighbors. And third, it's better if the government is trying to put out the fires rather than to fan the flames. So as much as we talk about mutual aid, what my neighbors and I did together, we need to be pursuing governing power. And that means building a durable supermajority that is multiracial, multi-class, multi-sector, and that can fight for political and economic democracy.
Yes. Woo! Manuel for president. Okay. I think that there's no better story to end on. There will be a conversation later today about the future, and so maybe we leave this for them, which is there is a way to fight for and to win guaranteed income in a way that doesn't actually fundamentally transform our country or shift the balance of power in this country. And so for all of us in this room who are in one way or another part of this growing movement for cash transfers, for guarantees, part of this movement that builds the capacity for people to have more leverage, more power, more freedom, more ability to take care of themselves and their families, that we not forget that the big work, the big task in front of us, before us, is to really fundamentally shift power in this country. That we can do that there are no shortcuts to getting there, but that these conversations you're having in different parts of the country, these policies you're trying to figure out in Chicago, where you've actually won it, that they're all really about this bigger question. And how do we do it in a way that brings many more or millions more people along, right? So, Professor, it has been such a pleasure to share stage with you. And thank you all for being a part of the conversation.